He walked in like he always does now. Fast, confident, already mid-sentence about a meeting I wasn't invited to, a name I didn't recognize, a deal that meant nothing to me. But then he stopped, right in front of me, and that's when it happened. He looked me up and down, slow, deliberate. His gaze landed on my shirt, then my shoes, then back to my face. That half-smile curled on his lips, and he let out a small laugh. Not a chuckle, not a slip of amusement. A calculated sound meant to land. "Dad," he said, shaking his head, "you really still wear that?" I didn't answer, because I knew that tone. I had heard it before, not in his voice, but in the voices of those who used to underestimate me when I was just a factory hand. When I used to walk to work because the car needed new tires and he needed school books. When I patched holes in my boots instead of buying new ones because he had dreams bigger than the wallet I carried. He laughed, and the room, just for a second, laughed with him. His fiancée. Her delicate hand hiding her mouth, as if mocking me politely, somehow made it kinder. I looked down at my shirt, faded blue flannel, a soft patch on the elbow where the fabric had worn thin. I had sewn it myself. Mary used to joke it made me look charmingly stubborn, but to him now it looked cheap, outdated, something that should have been folded away with the past. He used to beg to wear my clothes. He once paraded through the living room in this very shirt, pretending to be just like Dad, back when the word Dad still had gravity. But somewhere between stock options and rooftop brunches, I became a man who embarrassed him. A relic in worn sleeves, a photo on the wall he didn't want guests asking about. I watched him pour wine into a glass I didn't recognize, watched him speak about foreign markets and smart money. He laughed again, this time at something on his phone. A meme, probably, or a text from someone shinier than me. I sipped my coffee, cold now, not bitter, just still, like me, still here, still in the same house where he took his first steps, where I paced the hallway the night he had a fever so high I thought I'd lose him, where I sold the car so he could attend that private university he barely thanked me for. I looked at my shoes, scuffed leather, soles replaced, not for looks, for loyalty. I didn't explain any of it, didn't defend the life I had chosen, didn't point out that dignity doesn't come with designer labels, because what he didn't know, couldn't know, was that in the drawer behind me sat something far more valuable than anything he wore. A box of watches, collected over decades, each one a moment, each one a chapter, each one purchased not with vanity, but with effort. They weren't flashy. They weren't even visible, but they held more worth than he could calculate, not because of the price, but because of the time I gave, the time I lost, the time I lived. And while he laughed at my clothes, he didn't realize he was laughing at the very man who once stood between him and every storm. He didn't see it yet, but time would show him. Time always does. It didn't start with a laugh. That was just the crack in the surface. No, it started months earlier, in the quiet erosion of respect. Little comments, casual suggestions, always said with a smile that pretended to soften the edge but never really did. "Dad, you should upgrade your wardrobe. Let me take you shopping sometime, just to freshen you up." People judge by appearance, you know. He said those things the way people comment on the weather, lightly, like truth wrapped in suggestion. But over time, the weight added up. Every remark chipped away at something that used to feel solid. At first, I laughed it off. "Old dogs, new tricks," I'd say. Or, "I'm not trying to win any fashion awards." But it didn't stop. And eventually, the laughter died, because the comments became sharper, colder, less playful, more pointed. "You look cheap, Dad." He said it once when I showed up to his company's weekend brunch, the one where everyone wore linen and pastel, and I arrived in slacks and a plain collared shirt. He didn't introduce me to anyone for 20 minutes. When he finally did, he called me old school, and his friends laughed like it was a punchline. I laughed too, because that's what fathers do. They absorb the hits and smile through the bruises. But that night, when I got home, I took off my shirt slower than usual, hung it on the chair instead of the closet, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at my hands. The same hands that once built him a treehouse in the backyard. The same hands that worked 12-hour shifts in a warehouse, so he'd never see the inside of one. Rough, calloused, knuckles swollen from decades of labor, a small scar across the palm from a nail that went through when I slipped, rebuilding the porch. These hands carried him, fed him, tucked him in, lifted him out of despair when he flunked his first year of college. and now they were an embarrassment. To him, to the man who once idolized them, I never expected gratitude, but I never imagined shame. He wanted me to change, to match the world he'd built for himself, to fit the mold of his curated life. All minimalism and clean lines, champagne and silent judgment. He didn't want me gone. He just wanted me altered, tamed, packaged. I started noticing how he winced when I wore my watch. The big mechanical one with the scratched glass and heavy strap. The one Mary gave me for our 25th anniversary. He said it was a bit much. He didn't know it was the last thing she wrapped with her own hands. None of them knew, because I stopped telling them, because every story I tried to share felt like a stone skipping across a lake that refused to ripple. I became something he edited out of pictures, cropped from the story. And the strangest part? He never noticed what he was doing. To him, I was just falling behind. Not failing, just outdated. An analog man in a digital world. But what he didn't see was that while he measured life in brands and lighting, I measured it in hours held, in lives supported, in time spent, not shown. I wore the same clothes because they reminded me of who I was, of who I still am, not polished, but present. And while he mocked the way I looked, he never once asked what I had given up so he could look the way he does. He forgot, or maybe he never really knew, but time remembers. And one day, so will he. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. If you're still listening, would you mind sharing in the comments where you're from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life, where someone close to you made you feel small for simply being yourself? Your support means the world to us. If this story speaks to you, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep these voices alive. And now, let's continue. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind where the light filters through the curtains just right, and everything feels still, or should have. He was standing in my hallway, holding his phone like a mirror, flipping through online catalogs as if my life could be reordered by swiping left or right. "Let me just buy you something decent," he said. "Something clean, something modern. You'll feel better." I didn't answer right away. I walked past him, opened the closet door in my bedroom, and stood there for a while. The closet creaked. Everything in that space did. The wood, the hinges, even the memories. He followed me in, still scrolling, still speaking with that tone that sits halfway between kindness and control. He meant well, maybe, but meaning well doesn't make the sting hurt less. I looked at my clothes, row after row of shirts and jackets. No labels worth mentioning, no designer tags. But to me it wasn't a closet. It was a timeline. This one, a simple gray flannel. I wore the day Mary told me she was pregnant. We sat on the porch and laughed until the stars came out. It still smells faintly of the firewood we burned that night. That beige corduroy jacket, the one with the fraying pocket, I had it on when I carried my father's casket. He told me before he passed, "Don't wear black. Wear something I'd remember." So I did, and I never stopped. There's an old checkered shirt with a hole in the elbow. I wore it while painting the nursery blue, even though we didn't know if it'd be a boy or a girl. Turned out to be a boy. Turned out to be him. He didn't ask about any of that. He just stood there quietly judging. His face said it all. Worn, outdated, embarrassing. To him, clothes are armor, symbols, statements. To me, they were chapters. Fragments of a life sewn together by necessity and love, not style. He reached for one of the hangers. "Let's start here," he said, as if curating an exhibit on extinction. I gently took the hanger back, not out of anger, out of protection. He saw shirts. I saw seasons, moments, people I've loved and lost, places I stood when I wasn't sure I'd make it. You don't throw away those things. You don't replace memory with fabric. You don't erase a life just because the colors have faded. He sighed, frustrated. "You just don't get it, do you?" No, he didn't get it. And maybe, for the first time, I didn't want him to. Because if he needed me to wear newer clothes just to respect me, then he was never looking at me to begin with. I closed the closet door. The sound of it echoed more than it should have. He walked away soon after, muttering something about dinner reservations. I sat on the edge of the bed, looked at my hands again. These hands built that closet, hung every hanger, ironed every sleeve, held every person who mattered to me, including him, when he was small and scared and trusted me without condition. Now he wanted to repackage me, make me fit into his version of pride. But I was never built for appearances. I was built for presence. And presence doesn't wrinkle when you sit. It lingers, even when no one's looking. That night, I laid out my clothes for the morning. Same ones. No changes. No apologies. Because sometimes holding on to who you are is the bravest thing you can wear. It was supposed to be dinner. Just dinner. A quiet evening, he said. A few friends, some wine, good food. Come, Dad, he insisted. It'll be nice to have you there. So I said yes. Not because I expected warmth, but because somewhere deep down I still hoped that maybe this time would be different. I ironed my shirt. The same navy one Mary once said brought out my eyes. Polished my shoes, the old ones he despised. Brushed my hair back the way I always had. Simple, clean, presentable. I didn't want to stand out. I just wanted to be seen. His apartment was sleek. Glass and steel, dim lighting, and surfaces that looked like they'd never been touched by anything human. It smelled like candles you don't light unless guests are coming over. Even the air felt curated. They arrived one by one. Perfect smiles, jokes that landed too quickly. The kind of laughter that sounds expensive. I sat at the edge of the dining table, not quite at the head, not quite at the side. Just there, like a decorative piece placed for effect. He introduced me after pouring drinks. "This is my father," he said, the way you'd introduce an antique, gently with polite detachment. One of them leaned in, eyes scanning me like a catalog, and then under his breath, but not nearly quiet enough, "That's your dad?" followed by a chuckle. "He's definitely old school." And the table laughed, not cruelly, but comfortably, the way people laugh when they assume the subject is too old to notice, or too irrelevant to mind. My son didn't correct them. He didn't say, "He built everything I stand on." He didn't say, "He used to work 3 jobs so I could study in peace." He didn't say, "He stayed up all night when my mom died just so I wouldn't hear him cry." He just laughed along, lightly, casually, then poured more wine. So I sat there, staring into my tea, letting it grow cold in my hands. The sounds around me faded. The laughter, the conversation, the clink of cutlery on expensive plates. All of it became background noise to one unspoken truth. I was no longer part of his story. I was an accessory to it. One he wasn't proud of. One he included out of obligation, not love. I looked down at my plate, untouched. Then at my hands. The same hands that once spoon-fed him soup when he was too sick to sit up. The same hands that built the bed he used until college. The same hands that never once let him fall when he was learning to walk. Now they trembled, not from age, but from something colder. Recognition. I stood up quietly, pushed in my chair. No one noticed, not even him. I walked out into the hallway, buttoned my coat slowly, stepped out into the night. The air was colder than I expected, or maybe I was. As I walked home, I realized something painful and clear. He didn't hate me. He just didn't see me anymore. And perhaps that's worse, because you can fight hate. But being invisible? That's a silence you can't argue with. That night, I placed my untouched plate in the sink, hung my coat back on the hook, and sat by the window in the dark. No music, no light, just the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, a sound he never hears, a sound that's been counting all the moments he'll one day wish he noticed. I didn't go to the next dinner. He didn't ask why, and I didn't explain. Because some things speak loudest when left unsaid. That night, after I returned home from his dinner, the one where I was a ghost seated at a table of polished strangers, I didn't go straight to bed. I sat in the living room, lights off, coat still on, and stared at the shadows that stretched across the walls. My tea was still sitting on the counter, untouched from earlier that day, cold, forgotten, like so many things in this house, like me. I don't remember when I stood up, only that my feet carried me there, to the corner of the bedroom, to the drawer I rarely opened anymore. It creaked, just like I knew it would. The old wood protested, stiff from years of being ignored, but I didn't stop. I reached in and pulled it out. The box, rectangular, heavy, covered in a layer of dust thick enough to dull the corners, like time itself was trying to bury it. I carried it to the bed and sat down slowly, like someone visiting a grave. The kind you stop visiting when it hurts too much, and start visiting again when forgetting hurts more. The latches were a bit rusty. I opened them carefully. Inside, velvet-lined compartments, and resting within them, the watches, each one carefully placed, each one asleep but never dead. I ran my fingers across them slowly, as if greeting old friends. The first one, a modest Seiko with a cracked leather band. I bought it with my first bonus at the factory. Back when I used to clock in before sunrise and eat lunch from a paper bag under a humming light. It wasn't expensive, but to me it was proof that effort led to something solid. The second, a stainless steel Omega. I gifted it to myself when Mary and I paid off the mortgage. We drank cheap wine that night and danced barefoot in the kitchen. She always said I had good taste in timepieces. The third, an old Zenith, gold-toned, delicate. It was the one I wore the day my son was born. Mary wrapped it around his little hand for a photo I still keep in my wallet. Back when he held my finger like he'd never let go. And then there was the Jaeger. A quiet piece, nothing flashy but refined. I bought it after we buried her, because I needed something that ticked beside me, something that didn't stop, even when everything else did. Each watch was tied to something sacred, a sacrifice, a victory, a wound, a vow. But now they were just objects collecting dust. Like the stories they held no longer had anyone left to hear them. He used to ask about them. When he was younger, he'd sit on my lap and point to them. "Tell me about this one, Daddy." And I would, every single time, even if it meant repeating the same memory for the 100th time. But those days had vanished into the folds of adulthood. Now he wore watches with battery compartments he couldn't even open, ones that lit up and vibrated and told him how fast his heart was beating, but not why it hurt. He'd forgotten the stories, or worse, remembered but chose not to care, because in his world now a watch was just an accessory, not a chapter, not a marker of a life measured not in dollars but in devotion. I stared at the collection for a long time, and something inside me shifted. Not anger, not sadness, something else. Clarity. He laughed at my clothes, looked past my hands, ignored the years I spent building him piece by piece, moment by moment. But these watches? They never forgot. They carried every version of me that ever existed. Not polished, not perfect, but present. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for the world to see what he couldn't. Time to let truth tick louder than silence. Because while he spent his life checking his phone for the time, I carried mine on my wrist. And in my heart, I didn't sleep that night. Not out of restlessness, but out of reverence. The box sat open beside me, its contents scattered across the bed like old letters. The kind you don't read to remember, but to feel. I picked up each watch slowly, as if lifting an entire chapter in my hands. The first one, a heavy-bodied piece with a brass dial and worn leather strap. It still smelled faintly of oil and metal. I bought it after my second month working night shifts at the mill. 12 hours on my feet, coming home as the sun rose. Mary would wait with coffee and a tired smile, pretending she hadn't been worried. That watch had marks on its casing. From a day the machine bucked back and split a pipe open near my hand. I wore it anyway, not for timekeeping, but to remind myself that I was still standing, still providing, still enough. The next one was smaller, understated, stainless steel with a slightly scratched crystal. I bought it the day he was born. I remember staring through the hospital glass, watching him sleep with his hands curled into tiny fists. I'd never been so terrified, or so certain. I left the hospital that night, walked 3 blocks, and bought that watch from a second-hand shop. It wasn't expensive, but I needed something to mark the moment, something to say. From this day on, time is no longer yours alone. It ticked on my wrist through diaper changes, fevers, birthday candles. It was there when he said Dad for the first time, and when he stopped saying it as often. The third one nearly slipped from my hand as I pulled it out, the heaviest of them all, gold-toned with a blue face. It was the one I bought after we paid off the mortgage. I remember Mary standing at the kitchen sink, the paper in her hands, eyes full of disbelief. "We're free," she whispered. And we were free from late-night worries, free from the guilt of saying no when he asked for new shoes, free from the grip of what-ifs. We went to a small diner that night. Nothing fancy, but it felt like a palace. She wore a dress she hadn't put on in years. I held her hand like we were 20 again. And the next day I walked into a jeweler's I had passed every morning for 15 years. Bought that watch with cash. It wasn't a reward. It was a reminder. That time when respected returns everything. Watch after watch, I moved through them like footsteps through a life. There was the one I wore when Mary got sick. I remember checking it during her treatments, measuring hours in prayers. That watch stopped ticking the morning she passed. I never fixed it. Some things aren't meant to be restarted. And then the watch I wore to my retirement dinner. My son was there that night. He gave a speech, well written, polished, but impersonal. He called me a man of consistency, like I was a machine. He didn't mention the hours, the sacrifices, the small, quiet victories, just the outline, never the soul. And maybe that's what all of these were, a soul split into chapters, worn not to impress, but to remember. These watches weren't accessories. They were biography. Every tick a decision, every scratch a story, every strap a weight carried. He had forgotten. Or maybe he'd never really known. Because when you grow up protected, you forget what you're being protected from. But now the glass case in which they rested, dusty, worn, half forgotten, felt like a museum to a man no one visited anymore. And yet I sat there in the quiet, watching the dials catch what little light broke through the window, and I realized something that cut deeper than his laughter ever could. He may have laughed at my clothes, he may have seen my life as plain, but I had worn time. He had only spent it, and one day he'd understand the difference, because time never forgets the hands that honored it, even when sons do. I chose 5, not the rarest, not the most expensive, just 5 that meant something. The one Mary gave me, the one I bought when we closed on the house, the one I wore to his high school graduation, the one that never ticked again after her funeral, and the one that saw me through my final day at work, when I handed over my keys and walked out, not as a manager, but just as a man. I placed them gently into a small leather roll. My hands shook a little as I fastened the strap, not from age, but from what this meant. I didn't tell him I was going. He wouldn't have understood. Or worse, he would have tried to stop me. Not out of concern, but out of image. It was a Wednesday. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that doesn't threaten rain but promises reflection. I rode the train into the city. The building was exactly what I imagined. Tall stone, faceless. A marble floor that clicked with every footstep like it was measuring your worth with sound. The receptionist wore gloves when she took the roll from my hands. No expression, just professionalism. I waited in a room that didn't smell like anything, the kind of place so sterilized it refused to remember. And then after what felt like an hour of silence and suits, they called me in. There were 3 of them, one young, eager, one older, thoughtful, and one who said nothing, but whose eyes said everything. They unrolled the leather case slowly, as if expecting to see dust and disappointment. But then the silence changed. The young one leaned forward first. His eyes widened. He reached out, then stopped. Waited, looked at the older man. "May I?" I nodded. He picked up the Jaeger, had turned it, examined the back, whispered something under his breath I didn't catch, then handed it to the man beside him. Each of them took a piece, cradled it like something sacred, and no one spoke for a long while. Finally, that older gentleman looked up, his hands still holding the piece with the cracked glass. "Where," he asked softly, "did you keep these all these years?" The question hit harder than I expected, because no one had asked me where I had kept anything. Not my grief, not my effort, not my time. I cleared my throat. "In a drawer," I said. "At home." He nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on the watch. Like he wasn't just holding metal and glass, but history. They didn't ask where I bought them. They didn't question the where. They didn't care about the missing boxes, the faded straps. They cared about the soul. "These are exceptional," the quiet man finally said, "not just in value, but in presence." Presence, that word. They offered to keep them for appraisal. Said they'd send a detailed report. I nodded, signed the forms with hands that remembered how to write, even when they hadn't held a pen in weeks. As I walked out of that building, past walls lined with glass and gold, I didn't feel poor. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel outdated. I felt seen. Not for my clothes, not for how I spoke, but for what I had carried. I took the train home in silence. The city rushed by, unbothered by my small victory. But I sat straighter, not out of pride, but out of something deeper, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Worth, because for once someone had looked not at me, but through me. And what they saw was time well spent. The report came 3 days later. A thick envelope, heavier than it should have been, resting neatly in my mailbox, like it knew it carried something sacred. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first, set the table, cleared the clutter from the counter, sat down in my chair. The same one I used to rock him to sleep in when his cries couldn't be calmed by anything but the rhythm of my heartbeat. Then I sliced the envelope open. Inside, 5 folded pages, each one dedicated to a watch I had worn through chapters of my life most people wouldn't even believe. They had cataloged every detail. Every scratch had been considered. Every number on every dial explained. Every imperfection became a feature. The first page read, Model, Jaeger-LeCoultre, year 1959. Type, military issue, limited deployment. Notes, issued to foreign advisors during Cold War operations, original dial. Restored, but authentic. Rare. Estimated value, $58,000 USD. I paused. That watch cost me 2 weeks' wages back then. I'd bought it from a friend leaving the country who needed cash. He never told me where he got it. I just liked the way it felt on my wrist. Like it meant something. Like it had seen things I hadn't. The second page was even more surprising. Omega Semester. Year 1971. Error dial, misprint C Mazer. Condition, fair, unrestored. Note, extremely rare manufacturing defect. Fewer than 10 recorded. Believed destroyed or replaced. Estimated value, $72,000 USD. I remember thinking I got ripped off when I first saw the typo, but it worked, and I couldn't afford to be picky. Mary laughed when I showed her. It's spelled wrong, she said, just like the cake you got me for our anniversary, and I love both. I ran my fingers over that page longer than I should have, not because of the number, but because someone saw worth in what the world dismissed. The third piece was one I had almost left behind. Zenith el Primero, Goldface, year 1969, limited release, first generation run. Note, no known models of this condition in circulation. Estimated value, $96,000 USD. I read it twice, then 3 more times. I had worn that one through my son's entire childhood. It had scratches from lifting bikes, pulling weeds, holding the steering wheel through snowstorms. It had sweat and laughter in its gears. I never polished it. I never needed to. The other 2 were similar, not quite as rare, but still precious. To them because of rarity. To me because of life. They finished the report with a sentence I didn't expect. In all our years, few private collections have matched the integrity, history, and condition of what you've shared. These watches are not just valuable. They're remarkable. I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and I sat there for a long time, not smiling, not celebrating, just breathing, because I didn't bring them to the auction house to sell, not to cash out, not to gloat. I brought them because I needed to know if I was wrong all these years, if maybe I had held on to things that didn't matter anymore, if maybe, just maybe, I had been foolish to believe that time, when worn with love, could outlast everything. But I wasn't wrong. Time, when honored, doesn't rust. It deepens. And the things we carry quietly sometimes end up being the loudest legacy we leave behind. He called that night. Didn't know about the report. Didn't ask about my day. Just talked about a new jacket he'd bought. Said I'd look more relevant if I wore something like it. I let him talk. Let him fill the silence with fabric and buttons and his next dinner party. And all the while I sat beside the watches, ticking softly beside me, like a choir of everything I never had to prove. I didn't need to be loud. I just needed to know. And now I did. The world may have laughed at my shirt, but time never laughed at me. It remembered. The letter sat on my desk for a week. I hadn't told him. I didn't frame it. I didn't call a single soul. Because when something reaches deep into your life, deeper than value, deeper than money, you don't display it. You sit with it. You let it speak. And this letter, it spoke louder than anything I could have said. I reread it every night, not because I didn't believe the numbers, but because each sentence felt like a restoration, like something long dismissed in me was slowly being remembered. Total appraisal value, $287,000, just 5 watches. 5. About the same as the value of his entire condo in the city. His car, too. The one with the black leather seats and the speakers that cost more than my refrigerator. The same man who laughed at my old shoes, who rolled his eyes at my flannel, who winced when I reached for the check in a diner because my wallet looked vintage. He thought I had nothing, but I had time, and time had value, because I didn't spend it on appearances. I invested it in living, in holding, in remembering. He had no idea, and I didn't feel the need to tell him. What would be the point? So he could nod in polite surprise? so he could brag to his friends about how his dad had secretly good taste. No, this wasn't for him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I folded the letter back into the envelope, gently, like I was wrapping a photograph of something I'd waited too long to see. Then I placed it in a drawer. Not the one with the watches, but another. Beside old letters from Mary, photos from Christmases that still smelled like cinnamon, a few notes my son had written me when he was small, when I was still daddy, not just dad. It all went together, because it all meant the same thing. Proof that I had lived a life, that I had given everything, that I hadn't wasted a single year, even if the world no longer saw it. He visited 2 days later, unannounced, wearing a jacket so stiff it creaked when he sat down. He talked for 20 minutes, about stocks, about rooftop bars, about someone who recognized him from LinkedIn. I just listened. At one point, he looked around my living room and laughed lightly. "You really haven't changed a thing, huh?" No, I hadn't, because I didn't need to. Everything I built, this room, this house, this self, had already stood through more than he could yet imagine. I made tea. We sat. He scrolled. I didn't mention the letter, didn't mention the appraisal, didn't mention that 5 pieces from my drawer were now worth more than the very table we were drinking tea at, and everything he owned. He wouldn't have understood, because he still thinks value is something loud, fast, new. But I know better. Real value is silent. It sits with you in the dark. It doesn't ask for praise. It just endures. After he left, I opened the drawer again, touched the envelope one more time, and I smiled, because I didn't need the world to know what it was worth. I just needed to know that what I gave, quietly, daily, completely, was never small, never worthless, never lost. It had simply been waiting for the right eyes to see it, and now it had been seen. Not by him, but by someone, and maybe one day that would be enough. He called it a small gathering. Just close friends, a few colleagues, maybe a client or two. A celebration, he said. He'd just closed something big. A deal, a partnership, something involving numbers I no longer tried to understand. He called to invite me. His voice was polite, careful, like someone navigating ice. "You can come, of course, but..." A pause. "Maybe wear something different this time. Not that flannel, okay?" That flannel. The one I wore the day he graduated. The one Mary once mended, right there at the kitchen table, humming her favorite song while she did it. The one that had caught years of dust, paint, and tears, and somehow still held together. I didn't respond. I just said I'd be there. The evening of the party, I stood in front of the closet again. Pressed shirts, clean jackets, even a tie buried in the back from a wedding years ago. I looked at them, then reached for the flannel, the same one. Washed, ironed, not because I was trying to be stubborn, but because I needed to remember who I was before I walked into that room. The apartment was brighter than usual, all glass and chrome. The lights cast long reflections in the floors, like the building itself was trying to be something more. People mingled with glasses that cost more than a week's groceries. Everything smelled of money, and something trying very hard to seem effortless. I arrived early. He greeted me at the door, eyes scanning my clothes before my face. "You wore that," he said. A quiet sentence, almost a sigh. I nodded and stepped inside. I didn't belong. Not to them. Not to that place. But I belonged to myself. And that had to be enough. He didn't introduce me to many people. Only when he had to. "This is my father," he'd say. "Quickly!" With that same rehearsed smile he gave to clients. I sat in the corner. Same chair as last time. Same angle. Same view of people laughing at things they wouldn't remember in the morning. They passed me without seeing me. They complimented each other's watches. Thin, sleek, blinking digital faces wrapped in steel bands. "Got it online," one said. "Custom," said another. I looked down at my own wrist. Mechanical. Heavy. Still ticking. Still mine. The conversations around me were loud but empty. Deals, vacations. What wine goes with what silence? I sipped my tea. Brought from home. He didn't stock the kind I liked. Never did. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I smiled when necessary. And I waited. Not for applause. Not for confrontation. Just for that quiet, inevitable moment that always comes when surface cracks. When realness becomes unavoidable. And I knew it was coming. Because time has a way of waiting for the perfect moment to speak. Especially when it's been ignored. So I sat in that corner, invisible to most. But I wasn't uncomfortable. I wasn't bitter. I was just steady. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew what was in the drawer at home. I knew what I carried, and I knew that soon they would see it too. Not because I forced them, but because the truth doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs time. And mine had come. The evening was winding down. The voices grew softer, the glasses emptier, the conversation starting to dissolve into repetition. Someone turned the music lower. Someone else brought out dessert, plated too neatly to be touched. And I sat there, still in the corner, like a painting no one knew what to do with. I wasn't offended anymore. You can't be insulted by people who don't know what they're looking at. But I had brought something with me, not for them. Not even for him. For the silence. It was small, a wooden box, warm from my hands. Not polished. Not perfect. But it carried more than they would ever guess. I waited until the room was full, but the energy was low. That sweet, slow moment when people are tired enough to stop performing. And I stood, carried the box to the center of the table, where the wine glasses met like a chorus of empty promises. I didn't say a word. I just placed it down, gently, like setting a candle on a grave. They paused, chatter thinning. My son looked up, confused, almost annoyed. "Dad?" Still I said nothing. I just opened it, lifted the lid with the kind of care you only give to things you've bled for. The soft sound of velvet shifting inside, and there they were. 5 watches. Still silent, but impossibly loud, not shining, but gleaming like time paused to take a breath. The room changed. Someone, I think his name was Marcus, leaned forward. His hand hovered just above the box. "Is that a—" He didn't finish, because the second man, younger, sharper, finished for him. "Oh my God, that's a military-issue Jaeger. Where did you get that?" And then another, a woman across the table, pointed slowly like seeing a ghost. "That's a Zenith El Primero. First run? It can't be." Their voices had changed, no longer casual, now reverent. The kind of tone people use in museums or church pews. Even the laughter died, not from awkwardness, from awe. My son watched it all unfold. His smile faded, not from embarrassment, but realization. For the first time in a long, long while, he looked at me, not through me. One of his friends asked, "Where did these come from?" I almost answered. I almost said, "They came from nights I didn't sleep so he could—" From paychecks I split in half to make sure he had new shoes for school. From mornings I left home in the dark and came back too tired to eat, but never too tired to listen. Instead, I just nodded toward my son. "These are his roots," I said quietly, and I sat back down. The box remained in the center of the table. No one moved it. No one dared. It didn't belong to the moment anymore. It belonged to the truth, and the truth had finally taken its seat. The silence after I opened the box was unlike any I'd felt before. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't empty. It was full of things none of them knew how to name. One by one, the conversation faded into breath, forks set down gently. Glances traded across the table like quiet confessions. And then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a single folded page. The appraisal. 5 lines, each one a line from my life. I unfolded it wordlessly, pressed out the creases, and laid it on the table beside the watches. A few at the table leaned closer. They didn't speak, just read, line by line, number by number. One of them whispered the total under his breath like a prayer he didn't know he believed in. At 248,000, and then the room exhaled. Soft gasps, eyebrows raised, disbelief crawling across every polished face. My son stared at the bottom of the page as if the number were a wound. He didn't blink, didn't speak. I watched the color drain slowly from his face, as though everything he thought he understood about me was now something else entirely. He looked at me, really looked this time, and his voice cracked. You had this all along?" I didn't answer, not with words. I simply closed the box, gently, like a father brushing dust from a framed photo, like someone who has no need to explain anymore, because the numbers spoke for me, louder than I ever could, louder than all the jokes about my clothes, louder than every time I was asked to sit in the corner, to change how I looked, to shrink who I was, louder than his laughter. 248,000, but they didn't know what the number really meant, that it wasn't just value, it was proof of years, of sacrifice, of taste shaped by love, not by price tags. They saw the figure. What they didn't see, and maybe never fully would, was everything beneath it. The nights I walked home in the rain so he could have lunch money. The overtime I never spoke of. The hands that carried grief, groceries, and growing children, and still wound watches by hand before bed. They stared at the paper like it was a secret I'd hidden from the world. But it was never a secret. Just something they didn't think to ask about. 'Cause people don't ask how men like me build wealth. They assume we don't. They assume quiet means empty. That old means simple. That worn means worthless. But the truth is, I didn't need them to believe in the watches. I only needed to know I was right to keep them. To keep living with meaning, even if no one noticed. I closed the box, folded the paper, and slid both back into my coat. Then I stood up, smiled, and said the only thing I needed to, time speaks, you just have to listen. And then I walked out. Not faster, not slower, just steady, like a man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, because he never should have had to in the first place. He came by the next morning. No call, no warning, just a soft knock on the door. Not the sharp, rehearsed kind he used when arriving with clients or friends. This one was slower, like a man unsure if he had the right to enter. I opened the door. He stood there in a sweater instead of a suit. No cologne, no phone in hand, just eyes that looked heavier than usual. He didn't speak at first, just nodded. I nodded back and stepped aside. We sat in the kitchen. No wine glasses, no table full of strangers, just 2 cups of tea, the way Mary would have served them. Hot, quiet, and honest. He looked at the box on the table, not with awe now, but with something deeper, regret. I didn't know, he said finally. I didn't realize they meant that much. I stirred my tea, watched the steam curl toward the ceiling like smoke from memories too old to name. No, I said. You didn't. His head lowered slightly, but I wasn't trying to shame him. I was simply done hiding. You always told me I looked poor, I continued, as if the fabric on my back measured the man underneath it. He swallowed hard, didn't interrupt, didn't argue. I reached for the watch I was wearing, the old Seiko with the cracked glass and leather band worn soft from years of use. I placed it gently on the table between us. This one bought your first bike, I said. I wore it the day we took your training wheels off, the day you crashed into the neighbor's mailbox and cried like your world ended. He smiled barely, eyes still down. This one? I pointed toward the gold zenith resting in the open box. That one came the week I worked 30 days straight, just so we could put a down payment on the house you grew up in. He nodded slowly, but I wasn't done. You thought the treasure was in the watches. I shook my head. No, the treasure was in the time. He looked up at me then, really looked. You want to know what your real inheritance is? I said. It's not these. It's what I traded for them. Hours, years, Sundays I didn't rest, birthdays I worked through, moments I missed because I was too busy building a life you could live in without fear. He said nothing, but I saw it, that flicker in his expression, recognition, the quiet collapse of a wall he didn't even know he'd built. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't trying to impress me, or outgrow me, or fix me. He was just listening. I leaned back in my chair. Let the moment stretch. Let it breathe. These watches, I said, they're not for sale. They're not trophies. They're not fashion. He nodded again. Still no words. But they weren't needed, because his silence finally meant presence, not absence. And I knew he didn't just see the watches now. He saw me, not the man in the flannel, not the father with old shoes, not the background character in his glittering life, but the man who carried time on his wrist and never once let it go. The real inheritance wasn't under glass. It was seated across from him, tea in hand, finally heard. It was quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache, but listens. The party was over, the guests gone, the box back in its drawer, and life, the ordinary steady rhythm of it, returned like an old friend I'd missed. I swept the porch, watered the garden, washed 2 teacups by hand, even though I could have used the dishwasher. The phone didn't ring, no texts, no visits. But I wasn't waiting, not anymore. And then one morning, I came into the kitchen and saw it. It wasn't dramatic. There was no envelope, no grand gesture, just a folded newspaper, neatly placed in the center of the table. The same table where he once rolled his eyes, the same one where Mary used to hum while cutting fruit. The headline was circled, The Hidden Legacy. One man's watch collection stuns experts. And beneath it, a subtitle, A Quiet Collector's Lifetime of Patience and Depth reveals a story far greater than gold. There were photos of the watches, of hands holding them, of words I didn't say but that the reporter somehow still found between the details. They called me an ordinary man, but there was reverence in how they said it, as if ordinary was finally being recognized as something holy. Beside the paper sat a torn scrap of notepad, a scribble, no signature, just ink. I never saw all of you. I'm sorry. And that was it. No long letter, no speech, just 7 words. But they landed louder than anything else could, because it wasn't an apology built from guilt. It wasn't a performance. It was something rarer. It was real. I stood there for a long time, one hand resting on the back of the chair, the other gently smoothing the note. There were no tears, not this time, just breath, full grounded breath, because in that small, quiet sentence, he had given me what I had waited years to receive, recognition, not for the things, but for the life behind them. He saw the cracks now, and the hands that held everything together. He saw the hours I never charged him for, the moments I carried for both of us, and he understood, finally, that love doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears flannel. Sometimes it walks slow. Sometimes it keeps its worth in drawers, not on sleeves. I folded the paper gently, placed the note inside, and I sat, alone, but not invisible. And that was enough. This morning I put on the same old shirt, the one with the faded elbows, the pockets sewn twice, the threads soft as memory. It still fits. Maybe a little looser now, maybe a little more honest. And I fastened the buttons slowly, like greeting old friends. Then I reached into the drawer, chose just one watch, a simple one, the kind you don't brag about but trust with your time. It slid onto my wrist like it had never left, not because I needed it to tell me the hour, but because I needed it to remind me of the hours I've already lived. I poured tea, sat by the window, watched the world move the way it always does, busier than necessary, faster than wise. But inside this house, the seconds moved with reverence. Each tick, a word I never had to say aloud. Later that day, my son came by. He didn't knock the same way he used to. There was no performance, no showmanship, just a son visiting his father. He didn't talk about business. He didn't bring up parties or suits. He asked about watches, about names he used to ignore, about why one piece had a faded leather strap and what the engraving on the back meant. I told him the truth, not just the make, not just the model, but the moments behind them, the stories. The rainy Thursday when I bought that one for $60 and a sandwich. The night I wore that one to stay awake during a hospital shift. The day Mary wrapped this one in a handkerchief and said, "Wear it today. It suits your hands." He listened, really listened, and then without a word he rolled up his sleeve. A mechanical, simple, beautiful, worn on the inside of his wrist, just like I used to. He didn't say where he got it. He didn't have to, because in that moment I knew he had stopped trying to look rich and started trying to carry time. He stayed for dinner, helped slice the bread, laughed when the toaster jammed. He even asked to wind one of the watches, carefully like it was something sacred. And when he left, he hugged me the way children do when they finally know what their father gave. Now it's quiet again, but not the lonely kind, the kind of quiet that fills a home when everything's in its place. The watch on my wrist ticks softly, not loud, not urgent, just steady. And I smile, because time, real time, doesn't need to shout. It remembers, it humbles, it heals. It shows a boy what wealth truly is, and shows a father that he was never invisible, only waiting to be seen. In the end, the house didn't change. The shirt didn't change. Even the watches didn't change. But he did. And I did too. Not in the way the world measures, but in the only way that counts. We met finally at the center of time, not trying to be heard, just listening, together.